Estamos grabando. Okay, so today we're going to continue from this point onwards, and this is what we did yesterday. Yesterday we reviewed the idea of verb, and today we're going to continue with this PPT. Later on, we're going to begin with the one provided for UMCE. Okay. Okay, so word classes, verb morphology. In English, inflectional morphemes in verb signal tense, person, aspect, and number. ¿Hablamos de algo de tense ya o no? Aunque sea alguna idea chiquitita. ¿No? Ok, so, vamos a dibujar, dibujamos, eso de ahí. Therefore, verbs, all over again. Verbs, they have some things called aspects. No, we're going to call it another manner. They are called variations. Therefore, verb phrases, they can vary in certain manners. Their variations are very different one from another, and one of these variations is the idea of tense. Tense is what we call tiempo, okay? Tense, tiempo. Okay, the idea of tense, therefore, is we can attach some inflected bound morphemes to show tense, right? As a consequence, we can attach the bound morpheme Z2 so as to provide the idea of present. And we can also attach the bound morpheme ED1 for the idea of past. As a consequence of all these, then the verb play can be written by using the inflected bound morpheme Z2, so we can have the form plays, or we can have the form played as long as we attach the bound morpheme ED1, right? Right. The result is this form expresses the idea of present, and this another form will express the idea of past. Atento a esta jugada que es importante. Spanish. En español no es así, y lo digo así porque es importante nombrar al español para que hagamos la diferencia y quizás entendamos de manera más rápida. En español, el verbo jugar puede ser ocupado como yo juego. ¿Cierto? Cierto. Y esa forma, juego, nos indica que está en presente. Me comí una E, estamos con dislexia hoy día, presente. El verbo jugar puede ser ocupado en pasado, ¿no? Entonces yo jugué. Y creo que se escribe así. Estoy pésimo, pero muy malo haciendo spelling. ¿Es con U o con E? Con U. Jugué, no, jugué, así con E no. Y pum, creo que así. Perdón por ser un idiota, perdón, pero la importancia de esto es solo demostrar que en español puedo inflexionar un verbo para marcar tiempo. Y que lo puedo inflexionar en muy diferentes formas. Como el futuro, jugaré, jugaré. ¿Cierto? Cierto. En este sentido, entonces, mis distinguidísimos, en español tengo tenses que son diferentes al inglés. ¿Sí? Sí. ¿Cómo pruebo eso? Lo pruebo porque al verbo raíz, al free morpheme, le puedo colocar este bound morpheme inflectional para marcar presente, pasado, futuro, e inclusive otras cosas, como yo jugaría, a ver, yo juego, tú juegas, él juega, ya, yo jugué, tú jugaste, él jugó, listo, él jugaba, yo jugaba, tú jugabas, él jugaba, ¿cierto? Otras formas más, en español. En español es posible hacer esta anexión. En inglés es imposible, y debido a eso, Decimos que en inglés solo existen dos tenses, present and past.
Porque en el inglés el futuro se reemplaza con el will siempre.
Porque es una construcción perifrástica. Muy bien. ¿Cachai? Entonces el futuro en inglés no es parte de un tiempo, es una construcción perifrástica. El verbo no marca futuro. Es la construcción la que marca futuro. ¿Queda claro, no?
Sí, pi.
Bacán, la hicimos cortita, qué bueno.
Entonces,
Más puedo...
disculpe por interrumpirlo. Entonces, esos son los dos tenses que con bound morphing se pueden inflexionar, pero los demás, para indicar los demás tiempos en inglés, todos son con construcciones perifrásticas, algo así.
Perifrástica, sí, exacto.
Ok.
Entonces lo que podríamos establecer es lo siguiente. Podríamos establecer que el tense es... Okay, we can establish the following. We can establish that the idea of the concept of tense, therefore, is a consequence of an inflection. Right? The only way in which we can state the idea of tense inside of a verb is because of the inflection which is present in the same verb. If we don't have that inflection, if we are not capable of doing that, therefore we won't have any tense. Right? Eso. Lo otro. Person. In English, we have person, the idea of first, second, third person. ¿Cachan eso de los pronombres o no? The idea of person. Okay, so the idea is this. Pronouns, they will show or they will entail a person. So we will have first person, second person, third person, right? And also we will have the idea of number. So we will have singular and plural. There is a mixture, or in other words, we can mix these two different concepts, right? So we can state that we will have a first person singular and then a first person plural. Then we will have a second person singular and plural and the third person singular and plural, right? So we will have this singular, plural. Okay, so finally, the pronoun. The first person singular is the pronoun I. Meanwhile, the first person plural is the pronoun we. The second person is you in both cases, and the third person singular, he, she, it. Meanwhile, the third person plural is they. Why is this important? This is important because the verbs will be inflected in order to show the presence of these persons. Okay, so for example, we all know that the Z2, the bound morpheme suffix inflectional Z2, will be used in order to state a concordance, an agreement between the subject and the verb. Right? Therefore, the verb will be marked in order to express this relationship between the pronoun person and number and the verb. ¿Se entiende?
Es como básicamente una explicación más larga de por qué se les pone S a los verbos.
Exacto.
cuando ponerle ese nombre.
Exacto. Okay, this explanation is about how do we use, or this explanation is about how we actually use the bound morpheme Z2, right? And that the presence of the bound morpheme Z2 is one of the morphological changes we can produce inside of a verb. And that's it. Basically, that's the idea. Okay? So verbs in English, we can change their morphological, their morphological forms by the presence of bound morphemes, right? One of these bound morphemes, or what these can, or what these bound morphemes can actually present, is the idea of tense. Therefore, bound morphemes Z2 and ED1, and the other way, or on the other hand, these bound morphemes will also entail the idea of person and number. In the case of the present simple, then the Z2 bound morpheme will be expressing the idea of tense, which is present, and also the idea of person, third person, and also the idea of number, singular. That's why they are used. ¿Queda claro?
Sí, profe.
Maravilloso. Okay, in Spanish, we won't say much about that. There are many differences between the number and the function of inflectional verb morphemes in English and Spanish. We won't say much about that. Verb morphology. In English, there are only 4 inflectional morphemes attached to verbs. Okay, there are only 4. The Z2, which signals third person singular, the ED1 or ED2, which signals the simple past and tense and the past participle, or the perfective aspect of regular verbs. We won't say much, we will see it later on. And the EN, I don't agree that much with this because they are talking about irregular verbs. And when we talk about irregular verbs, we're basically just, I won't say guessing, but I would say that we're not that sure, or it is not that reliable, right? EN, which signals the past participle or the perfective aspect of some irregular verbs, but just some of them. And finally, the ing bound morpheme, which signals the present participle or progressive aspects of verbs. Okay, so basically that's it. And to move on. In contrast to English, in Spanish, there are nearly 100 different inflectional morphemes added to verbs, which signal person, number, mood, tense, and aspect, though all those are variations within the verb phrase. The exact number depends on the variety in Spanish. Okay, as we already know by what's on the screen, it is not fair, I would say, it's not fair to say that Spanish is more difficult than English. I won't say that, but what I would say is that there is a wider variety of options. There's a wider variety of options within the Spanish language in comparison to the English one. Which means that there is a sort of richness, I would say. I dare to say, a sort of richness in the language construction. Even though I won't say it's more difficult than, but how can I prove it, right? But without any doubt, there is a wider variety. Okay. Person and number, we're just going to read it. Both English and Spanish verbs are conjugated. I don't like the word conjugated, but whatever. In the first, second, and third person, and both, singular and plural, we already talked about that. First person, the unipersonal or multi-personal addresser of the message. The second person is the addressee of the message. And finally, the third person, it is part of the message itself. I won't say much about that. Word classes, verbs, person, and number. Important difference. In Spanish, person and number are expressed by the verb form, which is inflected. Therefore, there is usually no need for an explicit subject or personal pronoun. In English, it is not possible. This feature is so important in English that it even has the presence of the neuter pronoun it. This pronoun is used to replace nouns that name things and animals or empty subject or objects. I'm going to devote a minute to this. In Spanish, as there are so many bound morphemes inflected, bound morpheme suffix inflected morphemes, right? Therefore, there are so many inflections that we can actually relate to every single verb. Then the presence of the subject, it is not usually required. Why is this so? Well, basically because we can retrieve the meaning out of the verb because it has a lot of meaning on it, right? Basically because of the presence of this bound morpheme, right? On the other hand, in English, that thing is not possible. Basically, again, because we just have a couple of morphemes which can be attached to the verb head. Therefore, the presence of the subject or the subject presence is compulsory. We actually need that subject. We need it that much, so much, that the language even allows us to use a neuter pronoun in order to state the presence of a subject, right? So here we have a couple of examples. It's raining. Meanwhile, in Spanish, we will just say está lloviendo or llueve, right? In Spanish, we don't need that subject, but in English, it's compulsory. And all over again, that's just because in English, we don't have a wide variety of bound morphemes in order to express or to establish the meaning, right? Or the relation to the person, the doer of the action. Okay, word classes verb tense, we're going to just read it. According to traditional grammar based on Latin grammar, tense is the grammatical expression of time by means of a verb inflection. Okay, so tense is basically the idea of, or it refers to the expression of time by a grammatical inflection. So what will happen if we don't have that grammatical inflection? We will express time anyway, but by using a periphrastic construction, just like in English. If we accept this and change, there would be only two tenses in English, right? Because we just can have this verb inflection, just two different verb inflections, set to ed1, simple present, simple past. In English, this language has ways in which other tenses like past, present, future, and hypothetical time to be expressed, not by inflection, but by using auxiliary or modal verbs, okay? Therefore, periphrastic forms and adverbs. Esto solo para consulta, no voy a decir nada de esto, son solo formas y nombres de tiempos. Nada de eso. Spanish has two more verb tenses than English, eso es para traducción, no voy a decir nada de eso. Y aquí vamos a parar con porque aquí ya habla solo de variaciones de la frase verbal. Comenzamos con el de la UMCE y este es el de verdad. Chiquillos, si tienen alguna duda, les pido que la comenten, ¿ya? Verb phrases. Well, so the very first definition is the very same as the previous PDF file. A verb is a large class of words that indicate events and a state of affairs, or which help qualify the reference of other verbs. That's Geoffrey Leach, 2006. By verb all, a class of words which have finite and non-finite forms and normally vary for present and past tense, a common term for lexical and auxiliary verbs. So what Biver, another grammarian, is stating is the presence of another classification, the idea of finite and non-finite forms, which we will see later on. Okay, so far we have the idea of lexical and functional verbs, and now we have the idea of finite and non-finite verbs, okay? Verb function and clauses. Main verbs versus auxiliary verbs, we already talked about that, and we will refer to the idea of phrase, okay? Let's refer to the idea of phrase. Ayer hablamos algo de la idea de frase, ¿no?
De que cada frase tenía como su cabeza y eso dependía de cómo se clasificaba.
Exacto, muy bien.
Sí, lo pasamos. O
Ya,
sea, lo vimos, como que lo mencionó.
Ya, ahora vamos a ver un poquito más en profundidad y los quiero bien atentos. A phrase, then, is the third element within the grammatical hierarchy, right? Is the third element or stage within the grammatical hierarchy. Stage within the grammatical hierarchy. So we have morphemes, lexemes, and then phrases. A phrase is built around a head, right? A head is an obligatory and most important element inside of the phrase. Inside of the phrase. A head is being modified, or heads are modified by some elements called modifiers. Okay? And these modifiers will be called pre-modifiers and post-modifiers. Okay? So basically, a phrase will be something like this. This means that inside of a phrase, we will have a head, which can be modified by modifiers. And if they are placed before the head, they will be called pre-modifiers. And if they are placed after the head, they will be called post-modifiers. Right? Right. As an example of this,
Profe, perdón, me perdí un poco. ¿Qué es el MHM?
es el resumen de qué es una frase. Una
Ah, ya.
frase está construida de un head, que es obligatorio, más elementos opcionales llamados modifiers.
Ah, es modifier, head modifier.
Exacto. Los
Ya,
que
ya,
están
ya. Eso
adelante,
no había cachado.
ya, los que están adelante del head se llaman pre-modifiers y los que están después del head, post-modifiers.
Ya, Pi, gracias.
Entonces, esta es la jugada principal, chiquillos. Les pido por favor extremada atención aquí. El profe les va a pedir hacer esto. Analice sintácticamente, in English, provide a syntactic analysis for the following sentence. I play football. The very first thing you will do is to look for the verb phrase. ¿Cómo pillo la verb phrase? Entonces, en verde nuevamente, verb phrase. No, la vamos a hacer más ordenada. ¿Cómo pillo una verb phrase? Primero hablemos qué es una verb phrase. A verb phrase, its symbol is VP, is built around a verb head. Its symbol is verb head. And again, I'm going to change color again. La parte de arriba es la forma y la parte de abajo es la función. Profe, ¿qué dice eso? Dice que en un análisis sintáctico se va a colocar la forma, o sea, su categoría, o sea, sustantivo, adjetivo, verbo o lo que sea, arriba, slash y abajo la función dentro de la frase. En este caso, adentro de una frase verbal hay un verb head, por lo tanto, su símbolo es verb, como forma, slash, y su función es head, H. ¿Ya? Adentro de una frase verbal también existirán auxiliary, lo voy a hacer bien, se me olvida que lo estoy haciendo completo. También existirán auxiliary verbs, okay? And the symbol will be auxiliary verb pre-modifiers. Pre-modifiers. ¿Por qué solo pre-modifiers? Because inside of verb phrases, you just will have, or will just have, auxiliary verbs pre-modifiers. Can I find an auxiliary verb post-modifier? No, you can't find that. Okay? Okay. Dicho eso, volvamos al ejercicio supuesto de la prueba. Provide a syntactic analysis for the following sentence. Lo primero que tengo que hacer es buscar la verb phrase. ¿Qué es una verb phrase? Es algo que está construido alrededor de un head, que es obligatorio y es el más importante. Me pregunto, pregunta 1. ¿Cuál es la acción de esta oración? ¿Qué palabra marca la acción? O sea, ¿dónde está el verbo de esta acción?
Play.
Play. Perfecto. ¿Hay más verbos allí dando vuelta? No, solo está play, ¿cierto? Separo entonces play del resto de la oración ocupando round brackets. Debido a que play es el único verbo, ¿sí? Voy a decir que play es el verb head. Y debido a que el head es un verbo, esto se llama verb phrase. ¿Queda claro el proceso analítico? ¿Qué me llevó a pensar esto?
Sí.
¿Sí? Ya, segundo ejemplo. Again, provide a syntactic analysis for the following sentence. The very first stuff I'm going to do is looking for the verb phrase. Therefore, I'm going to look for the verbs. I will read it, I will play football, and I will say, okay, the verbs are... Which are the verbs inside of this sentence?
El will and play.
Will and play, right? Y ahí está la acción marcada, ¿no? Will play, esa es la acción. Esos son los verbos. Esa es la frase verbal. La separo del resto de la oración por round brackets. Will play. ¿Cuál de las dos palabras es la obligatoria, la más importante?
Play.
Play, ¿cierto? Play es el verb head. Y will, ¿qué es lo que está haciendo? No necesito que me diga el término correcto y exacto ahora, sino que me diga, según usted, si aparece will ahí, ¿qué es lo que está haciendo?
Está indicando que en el futuro.
Ya, perfecto, indica que es futuro. Pero, ¿qué cosa es futura? Fútbol, I, play, ¿qué es futuro?
Aquí,
De,
va a jugar.
de que va a jugar, el play está en futuro, ¿cierto? Por lo tanto, su significado se le entrega a play. Por lo tanto, modifica a play. Y como está delante de play, es un pre-modifier, o sea, will es un verbo auxiliar pre-modifier. Como el head es un verbo, esto es una verb phrase. ¿Queda claro cómo llegamos a este resultado?
Sí, profe.
Perfecto. haga el que sigue. I might want to play football. ¿Está listo? Sí, listo. Okay, so the teacher asked me to provide a syntactic analysis out of this sentence, and I will read it. I might want to play football, so the very first stuff I'm going to do is looking for the verbs. Might want to play, those are the verbs, therefore this is the verb phrase, right? Right. Now I'm going to ask myself, which is the most important verb out of these three? And I will say is play. Right? Why play? Well, because might, play, want to play. All the other two auxiliary verbs are providing information about the verb head, right? Now, want to, as we already know, is a semi-modal verb. Therefore, it belongs to the auxiliary verbs. And as it is in front of the verb head, it is a premodifier. Then, might is a modal verb, therefore an auxiliary verb. And as it is in front of the verb head, is another premodifier. As the head is a verb, this is the verb phrase. Is there any doubt? ¿Estamos bien? ¿Dudas?
Lo único que hay que considerar para decir si es una verb phrase es que la cabeza sea un verbo, ¿cierto?
Sí. Y que las verb phrases están hechas solo de verbos. Y esa es una buena forma de encontrarlas.
¿Y qué pasa con might, want? ¿No es una perifrásica?
Sí, pero might le entrega su significado a play y want to le entrega su significado a play. Así que por eso las dos, a pesar de que hacen perífrasis, la hacen siempre con el verb head. No sé si le queda claro.
Sí, como que al haber un head, un verb head, todo queda subordinado a él.
Excelente, esa es la idea. Los heads hacen que todo lo que esté dentro de una frase trabajen para ellas o ellos. Eso es lo que hace un head. Muy, muy, muy bien. ¿Alguna duda más? ¿Avanzo? Avanzo. Verb, function, and classes. Main verbs and auxiliary verbs. We already talked about that, and I already showed you the way in which you will be analyzing them. A main verb play a central role in clauses. They usually occur in the middle of a clause. They are the most important in the clause. Okay, why is this PDF file saying that they usually and not always occur in the middle of a clause? Well, basically because you can have imperatives, right? So in the first example, this one, the verb phrase is in the middle of the clause, right? In the second example, it's also in the middle of the clause, and in the third example, it's also in the middle of the clause. But what will happen if I have an imperative? Like, stop playing. In this specific example, then, the verb phrase is not in the middle of the clause, but at the very beginning. But that is just a feature of imperatives. Okay, that's why we say that the main verb is always in the middle, not always, because in imperatives you have them at the very beginning. Okay. They are the most important thing in the clause. Well, basically they are saying that because a rule or perhaps the rule, so as to have a clause, is to have a verb phrase. If you don't have a verb phrase, you don't have clauses, cláusulas. That's why it says they are the most important thing in the clause. Okay. Then main verbs, they determine the other clause elements. They determine the valency pattern. Okay. When we take a look at the example I will play, then what we might state is, okay, that's a sentence, it's an English sentence, therefore an English clause created out of 3 different phrases. Okay, this is a pronoun. We haven't talked about this yet. And this is a noun phrase. And this is another phrase made out of a noun head. And this is a noun phrase. Okay, so in this particular example, then what we have is a sentence, a clause created out of 3 different phrases. The question is why? What do you mean by what do you mean by saying why? I'm saying why is this created out of 3 different phrases, right? Why do we need 3 and not 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever? Well, basically, every English sentence is created by a pattern. This pattern is called valency pattern. And it's the main verb, the one which is going to tell us the patterns, right? So with this idea in mind, we have this. I'm going to the Cambridge Online Dictionary. Okay. And now I'm going to write down valency pattern. Okay. And I'm going to change this stuff for proper. Okay, and we're going to look for this. Verb patterns. Okay, when we say verb patterns, we're saying, okay, verb patterns refer to what follows a verb. For example, some verbs can stand alone, others have to be followed by an object and some other stuff. What they're saying is this. They're saying that a verb, a main verb, will require something else, okay? They will require something to be followed to. Okay, so for example, the verb buy requires the presence of a noun phrase after it. I will state this example. I bought, and then I need something else. I need more information, and that information is an entity. I bought this, right? Okay, all over again. The presence of this element is required by this another element. In this case, this element is a main verb, therefore a verb here, right? Okay, these requirements are called valency patterns, right? We will see them later on, but it's important for you to know that the main verb is the one which is going to tell us the way in which sentences are going to be built, okay? ¿Queda clara la idea, más o menos, de valency pattern y la importancia del verb head en la composición de la oración inglesa? Espero que
Eso
sí.
es cuando se analiza así toda la frase, o sea, toda la oración, con cada, viendo así cada frase por separado. ¿A eso se refiere? Aunque no
No.
estaba prestando tanta atención.
Mira, a lo que se refiere es lo siguiente, es que la forma de estructurar una oración en inglés no es aleatoria. Estas formas dependen de los requerimientos del verb head. Por lo tanto, hay patrones. Estos patrones se llaman valency patterns. No los vamos a ver ahora, los vamos a conversar después, pero lo importante es saber que el main verb es tan tan importante debido a que él producirá la forma de las oraciones en el idioma. Ese es el resumen. ¿Ya?
Vale,
¿Queda claro eso?
sí, gracias.
Ya, perfecto. Avanzo. Okay. Therefore, a valency pattern is a term with the same general meaning as verb subcategorization, verb pattern, and verb complementation. Okay, so you can find them in all these other forms. Valency pattern is the pattern of clause elements that can occur with a verb, for example, intransitive, monotransitive, etc. Therefore, the patterns that will be produced by a main verb will give a name to the, or will label the verb as something specific. Like, for example, if the verb does not require anything else after it, it will be named intransitive verb. And if it will require, if it will require, for example, one single thing after it, it will be called monotransitive, and so on and so forth. Auxiliary verbs, they occur before a main verb and qualify the meaning of the main verb, right? Therefore, every single time that we see an auxiliary verb, we are seeing a periphrastic construction. Lexical verbs, primary verbs, and modal verbs. Verbs can be grouped into three major classes according to their ability to function as main verbs and auxiliary verbs, right? Therefore, we will have lexical verbs, which can only function as main verbs. For example, the verb play. Primary verbs, which can only function, or which can function as both auxiliary and main verbs. Those are the primary, the verb be, do, and have. Finally, the modal verbs, which function only as auxiliary verbs, right? Well, in this definition, there's no mention for the semi-modal verbs, okay? So, but we already talked about them, so be careful. Lexical verbs, they function only as main verbs. They belong to the open classes. Most have regular endings for forming past and present tense. However, most of the most common lexical verbs in English have irregular morphology, and they often occur as multi-word units, that is to say, phrasal verbs. Okay, I won't say much about this. I'm just going to add some further comments on the third point. Most have regular endings for forming past and present tense. When they say regular endings, they are referring to the bound morphemes ED1 and the bound morpheme Z2, right? However, most of the most common lexical verbs in English have irregular morphology. That is to say, they don't follow any rule, or apparently they don't follow any rule when they are transformed into their ED1 form or ED2 form, right? Finally, the fourth point, they often occur as multi-word unit phrasal verbs. That is very interesting in the sense of the lexical definition of words. So we'll discuss that when we get to that point. Primary verbs, on the other hand, they are only three: be, have, and do. They form a separate class because they can be used as both auxiliary and main verb. So, for example, he does that and he doesn't do it. Okay, I'm going to provide analysis for those examples. Okay, so the very first example for a primary verb, he does that, would be, okay, I'm going to look for the verb, right? The verb is does, as it is the only element. This is the verb head, and this is therefore a verb phrase. In this case, we can actually see that the verb do is the main verb, right? Because it is the verb head. And in the other example, he doesn't do it, right? What we have in here is another verb phrase, doesn't do it. This is the action. The last verb is always the verb head, and the other one, therefore, can only be an auxiliary verb premodifier. In the second example, we can see how the verb do is used in both forms, right? Or in both functions, can perform both functions. In this sense, auxiliary verb and main verb. Therefore, This is the proof that the verb do is a primary verb. Okay, now modal verbs. Modal verbs, they act as auxiliary verbs in verb phrases. That's true. They can't act as main verbs. Second, they do not take inflection to show agreement or tense. Yes, they can't take inflection because you can put okay, you can't change them into the past, and you can't change them into the third person singular for the present simple, right? They precede the negative particle not in not negation. This is interesting. We're going to talk about modal verbs. Okay, modal verbs. Modal verbs, they supposedly they can't take inflection and they precede the negative particle. So for example, if I say I will not play, the analysis will be then, okay, these are the verbs. The last verb is always the verb head, and then we have will as the auxiliary verb, pre-modifier. So not is what we call negative particle. Okay, I'm going to state it over here. Not is called a negative particle, and its symbol would be this. In the slides, it says that the auxiliary verb, the modal verb auxiliary verb, will precede the negative particle. One way in which we can prove that is by using a contracted form of the auxiliary verb will plus the negative particle not. Therefore, we're talking about the contracted form won't, right? And pre-modifier and place the verb head, right? So in the second example, we can clearly see that the negative particle not is related to the auxiliary verb and not the main verb. Our proof is that when contracted, the negative particle becomes one with the auxiliary verb and not the main verb. So be careful with that. They precede the subject in yes, no questions. Okay, so this is another stuff. Yes, no questions. Why are these questions called yes, no questions? They are called in that manner because the answer is a yes or a no. Yes, no questions. So I will love whatever. This is the affirmative, right? And the question will be, will I love? And this is the question, right? In the sense of the analysis, this is something interesting because I have already stated that a verb phrase is just built by using verbs. But in this case, I can see that the subject I is in the middle of them. So what happens is a movement, right, between the auxiliary verb will and the main verb love, right? In the middle of them, there's this pronoun head noun phrase, right? This movement in questions, in yes, no questions, is called subject operator inversion. Subject operator inversion, which means that we're going to move or to exchange the positions of the subject and the first auxiliary verb, therefore the modal verb. Okay. ¿Alguna duda hasta ahora, no?
Does that only happen with questions? With yes or no? answers?
Okay, let's take a look. What do you think of? Veamos, déjame para probarlo. Yo te diría que no. Ya, pues, súper pesado. Ahí está. Veamos una. Sabemos que existen las yes. Oh, se pegó, en serio. Yes. No. Questions, ¿cierto? Una yes, no questions creada por un modal, o sea, can. Oh, chiquillo, se pegó. Puta, que me da rabia. A ver. Tranquilidad. Tranquilidad, tranquilidad. Ah, pero por supuesto está todo abierto. Ya. Yes, no questions. O sea, can you talk? Can you talk? Right, right. In this example, this is an affirmative form. This is a question form or interrogative form, but the affirmative form would be you can talk. You can talk, right? En este ejemplo, entonces, la aparición del verbo modal, vamos a hacer en este celeste de aquí, este es el verbo modal, ¿cierto? Al realizar la pregunta, cambia de posición desde el segundo lugar, da lo mismo, no importa el lugar, pero cambia de posición con el sujeto, ¿no? Quedando aquí y el sujeto al otro lado. A eso se le llama subject operator inversion. Ocurre en las yes no questions. La pregunta del compañero sí ocurre siempre. Veamos una open-ended question. Open ended question con una WH word at the beginning. I run, how do you run? ¿Cierto? I run. So the other one would be how. Se pegó pesado y no puedo escribir, man. How do you run? Lo primero que yo podría decir respecto a su pregunta es algo bien interesante, ¿eh? Es decir, que hay diferencias sintácticas en la construcción de la yes-no question y la open-ended question. Lo primero es que en la yes-no question, la verb phrase, a lo mejor es un problema de diseño, ¿eh? En su afirmativo tiene un auxiliary verb pre-modifier y tiene un verb head, ¿cierto? ¿Por qué cuesta tanto? Deme un segundo. Claro, no lo puedo hacer con menos que esto. Claro, la primera, can you talk, tiene un auxiliary verb y un verb head, y aquí adelante tiene su subject, ¿no? Sería un pronombre head, y esto es una noun phrase. Cuando se hace la pregunta, entonces, se invierte el auxiliary verb, que sería can, se invierte el auxiliary verb, que es can, pre-modifier, ¿no? Y luego acá tenemos el pronoun get noun phrase. Lo que genera entonces, chiquillos, acá es que hay una inversión en los lugares. La pregunta ahora que ocurre lo mismo con una open-ended questions. Bueno, si vemos el afirmativo, tiene una diferencia significativa respecto al otro ejemplo, debido a que la verb phrase del afirmativo está hecho solamente de un verbo, no hay auxiliar allí. Y el sujeto está hecho de un pronoun get, ¿no? El pronoun genera una noun phrase y el verbo genera una verb phrase. En la pregunta entonces open-ended nos queda how do you run. Nos queda una turbina aquí y nos vuelve a quedar esto abierto acá. ¿Sí? Para responder la pregunta en corto al compañero, la inversión del sujeto con el verbo modal, por supuesto, cuando es modal siempre ocurre, pero cuando no existe un verbo modal, como por ejemplo en la oración I run, lo que ocurre entonces es la aparición del verbo auxiliar do, el cual no es modal, sino que es un verbo binario. ¿Ocurre el mismo efecto? Yo diría que casi el mismo efecto. ¿Podríamos decir que son exactamente iguales? No. ¿Por qué no? Porque el verbo do no existe en su forma afirmativa y solo en su forma interrogativa. Por eso, compañero, yo creo. No sé si responde eso a su pregunta.
Quedé un poco loco con lo del el do solo aparece como, o sea, en esa forma en las preguntas. Va un poco ligado como al did, al do, does.
Es que lo que ocurre con el verbo do, si ves el ejemplo I run, ¿cierto? En un tiempo simple. I run, I played, pasado simple, presente simple, a eso me refiero. I run, I played. El verbo do no está escrito en la verb phrase, en su forma afirmativa. No sé si entiende eso, ¿cierto?
Sí, profe.
Ya. Ahora, cuando se hace la pregunta, aparece este verbo. Solo cuando se hace la pregunta o la negación, pero en su forma afirmativa no está. ¿Cierto? ¿Cierto? ¿Por qué aparece entonces? Aparece para establecer la relación de persona y número. Siento que estoy dando unas explicaciones que en verdad son súper poco entendibles. Ejemplo.
Pero, profe, si es muy complicado, quizá podría reservárselo, porque en realidad le preguntaba por curiosidad, porque si esto no llega al nivel de las pruebas que vamos a hacer o todo.
No, pero yo creo que es interesante, mira. La pregunta es, aquí hay persona y número, ¿cierto? Ahí. Porque ese es un Z2. Lo que me indica que ese verbo está trabajando para una tercera persona singular, en el presente. Entonces, en la pregunta, como no tengo auxiliar, ¿cierto? Al no tener auxiliar, la pregunta sería solo por entonación. He runs, algo así. He runs. Pero creo que no es suficientemente directa, entonces por ello, se me imagina, se le debe colocar el auxiliar o le colocaron al auxiliar estableciendo la persona y el número antes. Ahora, el motivo de por qué hicieron eso, lo desconozco. ¿Sí? Lo importante, y para poder avanzar, es que los verbos modales, al ser verbos auxiliares, al momento de hacer la pregunta, desplazan al sujeto al segundo lugar, si lo quieren ver así. O si lo quieren ver de otra forma, el verbo modal se coloca delante del sujeto. ¿Por qué digo sujeto y no digo pronombre? También es importante eso. De house will be red, ¿cierto? La pregunta a esto, o sea, esa es la afirmación. Ahora, la pregunta de esto es, y aquí hay una verdad súper importante. Si digo, the big house will be red, la pregunta es, will the big house be red? ¿Cierto? ¿Cierto? Aquí nos dice dos cosas. La primera cosa que nos dice es que esta verb phrase tiene un auxiliar y que este auxiliar es un modal. ¿Cierto? Cierto. Lo segundo que nos dice, solo por mirar el ejemplo anterior, es que lo segundo que nos dice es que el movimiento del verbo modal no es solo adelante del pronombre, sino que es adelante del sujeto. El sujeto es el que realiza la acción. Me devuelvo a la forma afirmativa. The big house will be red. Voy a decir entonces, ¿cuál es la acción? Will be. ¿Quién será rojo? The big house. Y con esto distinguidos les presento otro elemento de análisis, la noun phrase, que actúa como sujeto. Y esta verb phrase es la parte verbal, el verbal de la oración. Por lo tanto, un modal verb cambia posición con el sujeto. Eso es lo correcto. No con el pronombre. Un pronombre es un sujeto. No sé si les queda claro eso.
Sí, pues, al final no se habla de pronombre porque el sujeto puede ser un noun, simplemente.
Excelente. Mira, inclusive este mismo ejemplo nos sirve para avanzar en otro punto más. Yo puedo reemplazar esto de esta forma. Will it be red? Lo que nos dice entonces, yo sé que es tarde y estamos todos cansados, pero por favor un esfuerzo más. El ejemplo es, the big house will be red. Entonces la teoría me dice que un verbo modal como will va a reemplazar o va a cambiar de posición a el sujeto. ¿Sí? Entonces la pregunta será, will the big house be red? Lo que nos demuestra entonces que el sujeto no es solo un pronombre, sino que el sujeto es una noun phrase. Y de esto no habíamos hablado. El sujeto no es un pronombre, es una noun phrase. ¿Qué es una noun phrase? Algo, una frase en la cual el head es un noun. ¿Qué más tiene eso? Una noun phrase puede ser reemplazada completamente por un pronoun. Y esa es la prueba de que era una noun phrase. Puedo hacer entonces, la pregunta, el afirmativo es, the big house will be red. La pregunta, will the big house be red? Y reemplazada por un pronombre, will it be red? Entonces con eso les probé tres cosas, chiquillos. Les probé, uno, la existencia de la noun phrase como sujeto el que hace la acción. Segundo, probé que los modal verbs no es que reemplacen al pronombre, no tiene nada que ver con eso, tiene que ver con el sujeto noun phrase. Y tercero, que las noun phrases son reemplazadas por pronombres. ¿Les quedan claras esas tres ideas? Les voy a pedir en un rato más hacer análisis de esto, entonces por eso quiero saber si les queda claro. Veámoslo después cuando llegue el momento de los análisis. Avancemos. Okay, modal verbs, they act as auxiliary verbs in verb phrases. Veo para arriba, lo sabemos. They do not take inflection to show agreement or tense. Lo sabemos. ¿Hemos hablado de agreement o no? Creo que no. Lo podemos ver en la próxima clase. No voy a caer en eso ahora. They precede the negative particle not in not negation. Ya lo vimos y di ejemplos. They precede the subject in just no question. Acabo de hablar de eso. They take a very infinitive verb as the main verb in the verb phrase. Ya, esto es importante. Okay, very infinitive. Very infinitive. Existen varios infinitives. Está el to infinitive y está el very infinitive. El to infinitive será el verbo to play y el very infinitive es el verbo play solo. ¿Sí? Sí. Entonces, un modal verb siempre va con el very infinitive. ¿Sí? Sí. Por lo tanto, I will play está correcto y en el análisis este verbo es un bare infinitive. ¿Sí? Sí. Alguien haga esto, I will play it, está malo porque ese play tiene un ed. No funciona así. ¿Por qué es relevante esto? Es porque nuevamente nos habla de que en gramática la presencia de un ítem influye en la forma del siguiente. De otro ítem, mejor dicho. Al final igual hablé de agreement. También llamado concord. Agreement y concord means that there's a relationship between two items and these items' forms will depend on each other. So, for example, if I say in Spanish, la niña, quiero algo que termine en na, un adjetivo que termine en na. Grandiosa. La forma la niña grandiosa en Spanish tiene concord. ¿Por qué tiene concord? Porque el noun head tiene dos características. Es femenino y es singular. ¿Cierto? Por lo tanto, el adjetivo que modifica este noun head debe ser femenino y singular. Y por lo tanto, el artículo que modifica ese noun head debe ser femenino y singular. Therefore, the entire construction works around the idea of concord that comes from the noun head. ¿Sí? Sí. En inglés, concord solo funciona entre el sujeto y el verbo. ¿Cómo es eso? He plays. Ahí hay concord. ¿Cómo hay concord ahí? Hay concord de la tercera persona singular a el Z2 tercera persona singular. Eso es concord. Subject verb concord. Así se llama eso. 17:35. Vamos a guardar esto como 8. Estimados, lo vamos a dejar hasta acá. Ha sido un día bien extenso, en verdad. Este es el 7. Ha sido un día bien extenso, en verdad. Y vamos a detener la grabación